Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video, we're back with another review for a recently released game. This time, going back to talking about the Life is Strange series, where here I'll be talking about the latest entry in the series, Life is Strange Double Exposure, a true sequel to the original entry in the series, a game that I personally really love. And just in general, the Life is Strange series is one that I do have a lot of fondness for. While I've really only liked the first game in true colors, I do feel like it's still a series that, again, I have a lot of connection to. I've obviously done individual retrospectives on each of the games in the series, even though my retrospective on Life is Strange 1's very antiquated, and I'll probably end up redoing that at some point. But again, I still have talked very extensively about the series, and through that, I was very apprehensive about this game. Obviously, inherently, it is an exciting concept. Again, seeing more of Max Caulfield, seeing the continuation of her story is something that, again, is intriguing. However, I was very worried, particularly because, again, I hated Before the Storm. I do think Before the Storm is kind of a travesty, especially when you try to connect it to Life is Strange 1. So again, I came into this game very worried that this game would follow that same trajectory, and it kind of does. And I think this is the thing about Double Exposure for me in general, is that I feel like I come out of Double Exposure thinking it's not good. I do not think this is a well-written game. I do think this game is, again, kind of a mess. Not necessarily for the same reasons as Before the Storm, but again, still has some inconsistencies with previous entries. Also has a lot of dumb plot points, which we will be talking about, where I didn't really think of this game as like a travesty in the way that I thought of Before the Storm, but more so just a game that's just kind of bad, but not to really any massive extreme outside of some ridiculous we'll talk about. But again, I do have a lot to say. I do have a lot of opinions about certain aspects of this game. And again, we will be running through this game from beginning to end, talking about my opinions along the way. So with that, let's start at the very beginning, starting it off with Chapter 1, Still Life, which starts off, as every other chapter, with a screen that allows you to pick Max's clothing. Why? Obviously because of microtransactions. Which, again, great start to this game. But either way, again, we do actually start the game with us seeing Max Caulfield 10 years later breaking into a bowling alley alongside her new best friend in Safi, where we do get a pretty lengthy section here and them exploring the bowling alley, with the premise here being obviously Max trying to find things to take photos of because she's now a photographer. This allows for us to bond with Safi as we navigate through the bowling alley. And in general, I actually thought this was a pretty good section. Again, while I definitely have criticisms for this game down the road, and at the end of the day, this still does have the typical negatives of the Life is Strange series and just how cringy the overall dialogue is. At the same time, again, that's also a positive for Life is Strange series. I feel like it's something that comes off as endearing despite how awkward it is. Though at the same time, I will say a criticism of this game for me is the fact that this does feel weird that Max still talks this way when she's supposed to be like 28 in this game. Again, the fact that this is literally 10 years later from how she was in high school. The fact that she still talks with all these puns and using modern slang is just so weird. Where again, I think you could excuse it back in the original game, where again, she's in high school. It's also the year of 2013. However, I feel like here, when this game's supposed to take place in the year of 2023, it does feel a bit ridiculous, but it does allow Max Caulfield to still feel like a similar character how she did in the original game. But also, to be fair, that's also kind of a criticism for me in the sense that it doesn't really feel like Max really develops much over the last 10 years. Like, you never really get the sense that Max is someone that is now this adult that has traveled across the world, and she still very much comes off as like kind of like a naive student to me, where I do feel like that's a little bit strange as well. But again, through this, we do end up interacting a lot with Safi, who is a character that obviously becomes very integral to the story down the road. But I do feel like Safi is a character that I liked initially. I feel like during this bowling alley scene, I feel like we see a lot of their connection. I feel like there's a lot to like there. I feel like she's a character that feels like she would have a lot of charisma, and feel like as the game goes on that we would further be able to bond with her and actually care about her. However, I feel like the game doesn't particularly handle that well. We strangely get very little Safi in the game beyond this. We see very little of the actual connection between Max and Safi, and are just supposed to just believe that they are super close because we're told that they are, and where it really feels like the beginning of this game is really the only point where they bother setting up this Max and Safi relationship in spots where they very much could have down the road. But again, this entire section just has us navigating through the bowling alley, taking photos along the way, to which I will say this game does involve a actual photo taking mechanic, unlike the original game. So again, that's kind of cool, I guess, but it culminates in us taking a photo of a nearby chandelier, to which after we take that photo, it then almost crashes onto us with Safi saving us, which very convenient. But anyway, this takes us to our first scene at the Snapping Turtle bar. That is a very common setting for this game, where we here meet Amanda, the first of Max's love interests, with Amanda coming off kind of bland to me. I mean, like, I think clearly the game wants you to romance her, and I do feel like her romance feels more right than the other one we'll talk about, but Amanda herself does very much just come off as a shell of a character, not really having much depth to her, and just feeling like this person who's just simply there to have a love interest in the game. But it is following this that we get the big controversial moment of this game that, again, seemed to really piss off a lot of the Life is Strange fan base, in the fact that we get a choice as Sophie interrogates us about Chloe, to tell her about Chloe's fates, having to either tell her that we broke up or grew apart, or that Chloe has died, aka deciding the ending of the original game, which I will say, as someone that I've always personally felt like Chloe dying was a more satisfying outcome of the original game. I feel like it shows Max's development. I feel like it's a spot where Max showed a lack of responsibility across the narrative, and her also showing that she's not willing to move on from her past. And I feel like by sacrificing Chloe, I feel like that satisfies that storyline for me, which, again, I think that could be debated. I think people obviously have very different interpretations of the ending, but still, I think for me, having the Chloe died ending and picking that initially here, it didn't really mean anything to me. To where when I picked that, I was like, oh, that's just the obvious choice. And I think the rest of the story plays out accordingly. I feel like the game is clearly written in a way that Chloe is meant to be dead. So where, again, in my initial playthrough, I didn't really see much of an issue with this until I replayed the game and realized how dumb the other option is. Where, I mean, to be fair, I should have known initially that just the concept of, yeah, we broke up is actually really dumb. Again, the fact that Max and Chloe broke up in the time since, and especially given the reason for their breakup was supposedly because of Max's power, causing some distrust in the relationship, and then Max also being stuck in the past, with Chloe being more about the future. Really, just in general, it's like, I do think clearly the writers threw this in at the last second. I think this is clearly a situation where the game was written, intended for Chloe to be dead. We actually kind of know that's the case, considering the initial rumors for this game that came out years before the game's release was that this game was set in the Save Arcadia Bay storyline. So again, they must have kind of cowered it out after the fact and not wanted to upset the fan base by making a certain ending canon, but by doing so, they really just made this game an entire half measure. Again, now having the situation where Chloe is alive, just ridiculous, and the fact that, again, they just broke up and she's just out of Max's life, which also feels like it was done simply just so they can add love interest to this game and have romance options, which is all really stupid as well. But and it's even dumber because it literally has no effect on the story beyond this. Chloe plays no factor in the story, and Chloe obviously never shows up in the story outside of these text messages, including one of her bantering of Victoria Chase on social media, which is really funny that she has a closer relation with Victoria Chase in this world than Max Caulfield, but also leads to a lot of ridiculous on that side of the story as well, and the fact that Max is supposed to be feeling this guilt for, again, sacrificing Arcadia Bay, again, killing a lot of people from her hometown. Yet that's something that is like kind of an afterthought in this story, where there's very rarely a mention until like very deep into the game any remorse over what happens with Arcadia Bay, and a lot more of it is focused on specifically Chloe, which I think is ridiculous in this spot. And I do think just in general, having Max sacrifice Chloe and that be the guilt that she's suffering through, and that being the reason why the parallels of Sophie end up being a lot more impactful, is, again, the better way to handle this story to me, and over this other world where Chloe is still alive, but now these Chloe parallels are still being made in a spot where they don't feel as impactful. Again, all this just feels so out of character for Chloe, and I understand why a lot of the online community is very upset over this, though not in a way that, again, impacts me as much. Again, as I said Before the Storm, again, I think Before the Storm is just a complete travesty, and I think everything Before the Storm does is terrible in terms of its connections to the original Life is Strange, to where I feel like those were a lot more egregious to me, to where, while I do think this specifically is very, very dumb and completely unnecessary, I feel like, again, they should have just bit the bullet and picked a specific outcome. For me, this, while bad, is not really this big criticism of the game as a whole that a lot of people seem to make it out to be. Again, where a lot of people talk about how bad this game is simply because of this choice, where really, I think the issues with this game go much beyond just this initial choice here. But really, again, this section at the bar ends up just being this way to get introduced to a lot of the other characters, where we meet characters like Reggie and Diamond, who are kind of just there for a lot of the story. We end up having to learn more about Amanda, so we have a conversation with her, which is very strange considering you also have the choice of whether or not to try to romance her or not, which if you're not trying to romance her, it's like this all feels very strange while we're trying to get to know her in a way that does feel very flirtatious. But either way, the scene does culminate with us meeting up with Moses, Sophie's other friend, who also becomes a pretty major character in the story, one that I actually do like. I mean, Moses is another character, doesn't really have much depth to him, yet I just found him to be a largely likable presence throughout the story, to where, again, at least there's that. But following this, we do get to see them hanging out, watching an asteroid, leading to Sophie revealing that she has good news, to where Moses ends up making us play the bottle cap game of hiding a bottle cap and sneaking it onto Sophie, to where she would have to reveal the truth, I guess. But straight up, I did fail this on my initial playthrough, but even if you succeed, this doesn't really do much. All it does is lead to Sophie telling you about this book deal that she has in the works, which, again, you learn about later anyway. Just following this scene as Max heads home, we do see her start to get headaches, which seems to be this point where the realities split, maybe. We'll talk about it, but really, just in general, the overall time loop of this game makes no real sense. But again, it's at this point where we do get the sense that Safi is in danger, where we end up following her to the Overlook with the reveal that she's dead. I can't believe it. This definitely wasn't something spoiled and something that was kind of obviously going to happen anyway. Though with that, I'll mention the fact that I do feel like this also feels a little bit ridiculous, right? That Max Caulfield has now had two of her best friends be murdered in front of her eyes in cold blood, which again, the fact that this is literally happening to Max again feels kind of ridiculous. Anyway, we follow this up with us cutting to a few days later, with Max now mourning over Safi's death, leading to the reveal that she, for some reason, has lost her rewind powers, which I guess like kind of makes a bit more sense in the world that Chloe is dead, as that's a spot where she just entirely reversed time. I guess at that point, again, she's technically going to a point where she did not technically have her powers yet. So again, the fact that they don't come back to her again, I guess makes somewhat sense. But again, like in this other world where Chloe is still alive, like the fact that she loses her powers here does feel a bit ridiculous. Being like explained as she like stopped using them, because obviously she realized how dangerous using her powers constantly is. But again, see Max mourning until she gets a message from Amanda who reveals that she's going to check up on her for some reason. This leads to a pretty awkward conversation with Amanda when she arrives, during which, if we decide to romance her earlier, she'll proceed to tell us that she doesn't think Max is ready for a relationship, which I can kind of get both sides of this, but I do think it kind of feels a bit weird to be telling your mourning friend who thought she had a prospective relationship in front of her that now that's absolutely going nowhere. But either way, eventually she gets a call from Yasmin, the mother of Safi and the president of the university, conveniently, to where this leads us going back to campus for our first of many pretty expansive sequences happening on the campus of Caledon University. Again, the main setting of this game, in a spot where I really don't like how the university is handled in this game, to where it essentially is utilized as this big semi-open world in the sense that you're usually given multiple tasks to do within them, having multiple characters you have to deal with, and you can technically do them in any order most of the time. To where, to be fair, I mean, this is something that was utilized in True Colors. Yeah, I feel like here, I just was kind of just confused that why we're necessarily doing these things at points. Though, to be fair, that will more so come later in the story, but I also feel like the criticism for me about the setting of the university is the fact that this is pretty much the only true setting of this game. Pretty much the entire events of this game do take place within this university. We never really get to see the city outside this, which I do think is a very strange approach to this story, especially in the fact that, again, in comparison to Life is Strange 1, something that makes the ending of that game a lot more impactful is the fact that we do see a lot of the city. We do see different portions of the city, different people across the city. Yet in this game, it really is just relegated to this campus, which makes the upcoming parallels between this and the original game not nearly as impactful there, as who cares about this university? And really, to me, all it is really just the setting for really tedious tasks that we had to do. But on the way to Yasmin, we do have a couple more characters we can interact with, where we can meet up with Reggie, to where he will introduce us to the Braxis Society, which is essentially this game's like cool kids club. Also meeting up with that club's leader in Vin, the other love interest of the story, who is also conveniently Yasmin's secretary, I guess. To where I really did not like Vin across this game. I mean, well, I actually did grow to like him a bit more towards the end of the story. I think something that's at least a positive for Vin is that he at least feels like a distinct character. He at least has a personality that doesn't just feel extremely bland. It still is a spot where I didn't like him. I do feel like Vin just came off kind of creepy to me. Though obviously here he is set up as one of the red herrings, which is, again, just an obvious thing that this game does as well, kind of just throwing a lot of red herrings in our face, where we also get the red herring of Gwen, who I liked Gwen as a character early on, and a teacher at the academy that had connections to Safi, and there was, again, some intrigue with her character, but it kind of just goes nowhere, and just the level that they try to make her into a red herring initially is just so over the top, to where, again, just was so obvious it's not her then. But again, we also get a conversation with Yasmin, who I think you can clearly tell from the very beginning of the game that something is off here, that will turn out that Yasmin probably did something wrong along the way, to where, again, I end up being right about that. Eventually, we do end up interacting with Loretta, another pretty pointless character in this game, one that catches us snooping on Gwen in a spot where she then tries to blackmail us for information about Safi, in a spot where you're given this big choice on whether or not to give her info or not, which really all it ends up doing is affecting whether or not she rats you out to Gwen, which again doesn't play much of a factor in the story. But anyway, we eventually end up meeting back up with Moses, who's obviously grieving over the loss of Safi, which I actually did think this was a pretty solid conversation in the game, one of the few that this game has. But following this, we end up leaving the building only to find Lucas Colmenero, another professor at the University of Connections to Safi that was very clearly supposed to parallel Jefferson, with him very much feeling like someone that was obviously going to be an antagonist, but one that wasn't necessarily the ultimate antagonist in the game, in the sense that there would obviously be this other conflict beyond him. And again, what do you know? I was right about that. But here he is essentially using Safi's death as a way to feed his ego in a spot where we can proceed to call him out for it or not. Really, no, that really matters. But following another conversation with Moses, we then finally get to the point where Max's powers finally come back into play, where Max hears the voice of another Moses, which we can see through a pulse that she can do, I guess. And we proceed to tail this other Moses, for some reason, giving us a tailing mission in Life is Strange that culminates in us seeing a vision of Safi as well, with Max reaching out to it, only for it at the end of the episode to somehow cross into this other dimension where Safi is alive. But again, this being the reveal of Max's powers, taking us to chapter 2, Penumbra, which pretty quickly sets up Max's powers here. The fact that, again, this entire game has these new powers for Max, and the fact that she could travel between dimensions, one where Safi is alive and one where she's dead, and the entire premise of the story at this point is now that we're going to be using this power to figure out how we can save Safi, which again, I think is actually an interesting premise. I think having these two different worlds that you can travel between, one, again, is interesting gameplay-wise, at least initially, in the sense that there's like some interesting puzzles that you can use with that, though, I mean, even those get a bit monotonous. Also, I think narratively, it's interesting in the sense that this gets to further show Max dealing with grief through the usage of her powers in the same way that how she did in the first game. And again, I think the fact that she does get these powers is not necessarily the worst thing in the world. The question is how? But again, the game never explains how she necessarily gets his powers. Where again, I think it's implied throughout the Life is Strange series that obviously grief is the way that people get their powers, that getting these powers is their way to overcome this grief that ends up coming into their lives. However, this game doesn't really tackle that at all, along with the fact that it's also never explained why these powers are so different than the original game, where again, in the original game, she had the ability to time travel. She could reverse time. But while also she did have this ability to pseudo-dimension travel through photos, which even then, again, it's still technically time travel, just again, through going to the time period of those respective photos, it's still a spot where those powers are very different than this, where in this game, these powers are, again, her being able to travel between these two different dimensions. They're happening concurrently. It's not even like this is like some sort of time travel, as we literally spend the beginning of the episode focusing on figuring out where exactly the living world is, only to find out that, oh, it's just the current timeline, just where Max had been missing over the last few days since Safi's death, which make these powers even more complex. And the fact that, again, it's just never explained why this is even happening, which is really just in general an issue with this game as a whole, where it just feels like things happen and it's never explained why these things happen. But as for the proper events of this episode, it does start actually with Max now in living world alongside Safi and Yasmin, with her being amazed at the fact that Safi's still alive. But again, we proceed to get an introduction to how the puzzles will be handled in this game, where again, we end up going in between living in dead world, we end up doing some investigating after Safi reveals that a cow skull that is hanging in the bar ended up being thrown through her windshield, where we end up taking this as a clue to who could have potentially murdered Safi, to where again, we proceed to investigate into this clue, leading to, again, a lot of monotony and having to go back and forth between the living and dead worlds to be able to reach the skull and investigate it. I was, again, initially I did find the overall puzzles of this game using the living and dead world and going in between the two to be interesting at first. However, I do think as time went on, these sort of puzzles became pretty monotonous, with it again just being very tedious to have to do something in one world, run back to the shift point, to go back to the other world to do another minor thing, and then go back to the shift point again. And again, just became a very tedious task by the end of it. But I do think it is at least an interesting premise for how the gameplay is handled in this game. But again, we eventually find out that the skull ends up being signed by Lucas Colmenero, which should make it pretty obvious that this wasn't Lucas, as why would he use his own skull to break into Safi's windshield, which was essentially frame him to begin with? But either way, but following this, we go back again to the university for another pretty expansive section with numerous plot threads we have to interact with. Again, essentially investigating into each of these red herrings. First, investigating into Vin and getting this like weird subplot of him having lost his phone and having to confront confront Diamond about it because he thinks Diamond stole it, which she clearly didn't, which just in general, Diamond comes off as a very strange character to me, where you can very much tell that she has animosity for Max throughout the story. And for a lot of the game, it really just comes off as like her not coming off very likable, though by the end, it becomes very funny why this is the case. But finally, we can follow up with Vin by finding him in Yasmin's office in a spot where he had found his phone, but is struggling and remembering the password, open it up, in a scene that, in retrospect, is so obvious what's happening here. Yeah, again, it did go over my head the first time, so again, good on them for that, I guess, but on the replay, it is actually like so on the nose, and like actually be pretty mind-blowing at how I didn't pick up on the fact that this was obviously not the real Vin. But again, it leads to another puzzle here of us having to go to the dead world to get the password from Vin, which again, dumb that Vin knows it and the other one doesn't, and how do we not question that? But that does lead to, again, the first point where we could like try to romance Vin, which is a very awkward conversation, where again, literally the choice of be sexy or don't be sexy is just so stupid. But eventually unlocking the phone reveals that Vin and Safi had previously been in a relationship, with us finding photos of them in bed. So that's something. Again, a plot thread that doesn't really mean anything. But also here we end up investigating into Lucas, who's just sitting in the middle of the lobby with a briefcase that he's being very secretive of, to where again we have another sequence of puzzles of us having to steal the key to the suitcase, which comprises of drawing on his standee and then going up to him and saying, hey, someone drew on your standee, which it's like, wouldn't he know that was you? That's so stupid. But either way, she ends up getting the key, opening the box, where we get the reveal that in Living World that he's attempting to follow a restraining order on Safi, to him suspecting that Safi's trying to break up his family, in a spot where we proceed to see in Dead World that him and his family have a good relationship still, which again, the only difference between the two worlds is Safi, where also again in retrospect, I probably should have picked up on how obvious this later Safi revelation was going to be. But again, here we do have the choice of warning Safi about the restraining order or not. Really, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter outside of whether or not Lucas likes you beyond this. But also here, there's another subplot revolving around Gwen, where in Living World, we see Gwen being fired from her job and proceeding to be kicked out of her office, with all this leading to a revelation that Gwen had led to the cancellation of Safi's book deal, which again, her only being fired in Living World where Safi is alive should have also been very obvious. But once all those tedious tasks are done, we proceed to leave the building to find Reggie having a panic attack over having gone to the Overlook and had seen a doppelganger of himself, which again, should have made all this very obvious as well. Eventually we get there to not find a doppelganger there, but instead find Gwen, again after having been fired, where she proceeds to reveal to us that she had been fired due to there being video footage of her drug dealing, which she claims wasn't her. Once again, playing into the fact that there clearly is this shapeshifter involved, where again, initially I didn't think of it as a shapeshifter initially. I did very much think of this as this is probably just the ramifications of there being these two timelines. But obviously, like once you know what is happening here, all this does make full sense. But this does lead to us having a minor choice of whether or not to stand by Gwen as she tries to burn the evidence to take a stance against Caledon, I guess, in a spot where I decided to not stand with her just because I wanted to see what was inside the USB drive she was trying to burn. Now, at the end of the day, didn't matter, and to be fair, I should have known that it wouldn't have mattered, and obviously thematically it makes a lot more sense for you to stand by Gwen. But again, I wanted to see the footage myself, but at the end of the day, all this really does is just burn your relationship with Gwen if you don't end up siding with her here. After that, we end up shifting back into the Dead timeline to find ourselves in the crime scene where the location where Safi's body was is now replaced with flowers, which felt so on the nose. But also here we end up having a conversation with Loretta, who again is just as irrelevant as ever. Outside in this moment, revealed to us about Maya Okada, Safi's former best friend that had previously killed herself, in a spot where obviously this becomes very apparent at this point that they're trying to make these connections to Maya Okada and to Rachel Amber, and how we proceed to investigate into the Maya Okada murder in the way that we investigate into the Rachel Amber murder. And considering obviously all these Safi Chloe parallels, again, it's very clear what they're trying to do in terms of having a lot more of these allegories to Life is Strange 1. But anyway, this ends up being broken up by the fact that Moses ends up calling us, needing help as he's being investigated by Detective Alderman, this very over-the-top, cartoonish, villainous character here who ends up being such an afterthought in this game, but is clearly here just to be this antagonistic force in the story, just for him to not end up mattering, where we get this pretty lengthy sequence of Moses revealing that he had actually taken Safi's camera from the crime scene. So now we need to help Moses by sneaking into the office and again do a lot of shifting to find a location location of the camera and get it out of the office, which I found a lot of this to be pretty tedious, with this being a pretty lengthy section, probably the longest puzzle section in this game, and one that kind of felt like it was halting the pacing of the story here. But this scene does culminate in us getting the camera, but also having this choice at the end of accepting a deal from Alderman, which in doing so would essentially be throwing Moses under the bus, which, again, obviously practically you obviously take this deal. I think there's no question. However, again, I didn't want to be a dick to Moses, so I didn't take this deal. And really, at the end of the day, again, nothing's going to happen anyway, considering Max is the main character. They're not going to kill her off or do anything that drastic here, where, again, I felt pretty comfortable not taking this deal, even though obviously in a practical standpoint, you obviously should. Which also, through this section, I should mention the fact that we do learn about another power Max has, in that she can somehow transfer things between dimensions, which she ends up doing so in a spot where Alderman ends up seeing it, which spooks him out coming into the following episode. But again, a spot where these powers are simply just not explained. This leads to the final section of the chapter and us being back at Max's home, to where we can proceed to look at the evidence, though that doesn't really matter. But what really matters is meeting up with Moses in the dark room, where they end up looking into Safi's photos, to where we get this big reveal with the final photo, the last photo that Safi took before she died, which is a photo of Max pointing the gun towards her, which is obviously this reveal that Max was the one to kill Safi. So again, that's a big reveal there, but also obviously adds a lot of questions. In fact, okay, was this a doppelganger? Was this the other Max from a potential other timeline? Was this Max from the future that went back in time? Again, there's a lot of questions there. So again, considering the fact that the first two episodes were released early and this is the big cliffhanger for that second episode, again, I think it makes a lot of sense to end the episode on this note, even though I don't think it's necessarily consistent with Max's character, especially based on certain choices you make previously, for her to be willing to kill Safi, really, no matter what the circumstances are. Where I guess you could say in the world that she did save Chloe in the past, that this is showing character development for her not doing that again, but that also implies that her decision that she made at the end of that game was a wrong one, which is also kind of a weird precedent to set as well. But anyway, we get to chapter 3, Spin, which is kind of where, for me, the game starts to meander around a bit, where I feel like through the first two episodes, while I have criticism so far, I do feel like I enjoyed the first two episodes, where I thought there was a lot of mystery being set up that I was actually pretty intrigued in, to where, while again, I think there's still some complaints to be had from like the characters and some of the game design, I did feel like I was pretty invested in the story up to episode 3, but I feel like episode 3 is kind of where it starts to waver a bit, and it really just goes downhill from there. But chapter 3 does start off with a pretty ridiculous scene of, again, Max obviously questioning she was the one to really kill Safi, which I will say, like, throughout a lot of the rest of the game, it really comes off as if Max, like, doesn't believe the fact that she killed Safi, which is weird considering the fact that, like, he knows, like, all this time travel and this dimension travel is possible, to where, like, why wouldn't she believe that some version of her killed Safi? Where, like, I think it leads to a lot of the investigation that happens following this to be very strange, where it's contextualized as if Max is still trying to hunt down the killer, when it's like, we know who the killer is. It's you. But again, this ends up being to a pretty over-the-top scene as Max is contemplating over the photo, which she just printed out for some reason and has on her kitchen table. That Alderman arrives to interrogate her, but then freaking out over what happened back in Moses' lab. And, like, no matter if you took his deal or not, he still comes off very antagonistic towards you here. But either way, he'll proceed to see the image on Max's counter, because obviously that had to happen. Add this fake suspense that Alderman is on the Max, even though, again, that leads to nothing in the story. But after he leaves, we do proceed to somehow have Max regain her powers for a second of being able to time travel through the photo like she did in the original game. Somehow, not explained, but either way, we end up teleporting into the image, where we get the reveal that this is essentially just a redo of Life is Strange 1, where this scene obviously feels very reminiscent to the final scene of Life is Strange 1, where now we see that Max is in the middle of a storm during her confrontation with Safi, seeing the storm in the background, which is a very similar storm in Life is Strange 1, where here it's used as like red herring to make us think that it's Max's powers that are out of control, and obviously it turns out later that it was actually Safi's. And throughout this entire sequence, it's very clear that Safi is very much paralleling Chloe, where again she even mentions Maya, and that obviously relating back to Rachel, and leading to her wanting to investigate into Maya Okada, and actually ending up being important for a little bit down the road. But at this current point in the narrative, doesn't feel like it's that important, but it feels weird that Max, in this spot where, again, she just learned that she herself is the killer, is now doing this big investigation into Maya Okada's death. But anyway, we proceed to want to get Moses' help in doing so, to where they reveal to him our powers, a scene that felt very reminiscent to us showing Chloe our powers in Life is Strange 1. But this scene culminates in Alderman catching up to them at the Outlook, preparing to kill them, because he's obviously this one-note villain. But that's until he sees a doppelganger of him in the background, seemingly him from the other dimension, to which he proceeds to interact with himself, to where they both proceed to die and get erased from the timeline, to where no one remembers that he exists outside of Max and Moses. And I should mention the fact that we are given a choice here of whether or not to help him or not, which either way he dies anyway. And again, all this is so stupid. Like, this is literally one of the dumbest plot points in the entire game, because it literally means nothing. Like, this is never brought up again. It's literally something that has no impact on the narrative. It's literally only here to add more context to this later reveal that happens at the end of this episode. But again, all this feels so stupid. And the fact that Alderman is this character that just feels so pointless in the story at this point, where he literally does nothing outside of serve as this antagonistic figure for the total of like half an episode. But either way, following this again, we get our typical investigation at the university, again, being given a lot of tasks to do, have us interacting with all the red herrings, where again, we can confront Gwen about Safi's book deal, to where we get the reveal that Safi's book was canceled because of it essentially being about the death of Maya Okada, which is trying to be covered up. We also then get to confront Yasmin about Okada, only for her to try to lie to us about Maya and Safi not being friends, which obviously shows her trying to cover all this up. But also we end up interacting with Vin, where we can ask him about Maya Okada, with turning out that he was really close friends to her, which leads to some tedious puzzles to try to gain some information from Vin here, with him eventually admitting to the fact that he was the one to throw the cow skull, which didn't end up mattering, while also revealing that Lucas had something to do with Okada's death, leading to us confronting Lucas and investigating his office, finding a manuscript of Okada's book, realizing that her book is essentially Lucas's book that he became popular for, revealing that Lucas was the one that led to Okada's death, with him having stolen her book for his own, and that the entire school has been trying to cover it up, which I think is, like, again, a fine revelation here. Again, it feels very weird that we're unraveling all of this in the midst of Max having just learned that she's the one that just killed Safi. But either way, we do also proceed to get a very quick scene with Safi in a spot where Safi's upset at us for not hanging out with her anymore, which again leads up to the events at the end of the episode. But I'll say very strange though, in the fact that Max doesn't spend any time with Safi in this timeline, as again, this is theoretically a world where like Max went into this timeline because of how grief-stricken she was over Safi's death, where you would think that you would want to be spending time with Safi. There again, the fact that she just like ignores Safi in this world to just do all these investigations seemingly for Safi is again just a very strange aspect of the story. But following this, we do get our scene back at the bar for the episode, which really ends up being the culmination of your romance options in the game, which is kind of strange that happens this early in the game. But essentially here you can choose to romance either Amanda or Vin, where romancing Amanda leads to this sequence that felt very reminiscent to what happened in The Last of Us DLC Left Behind, where Riley makes Ellie visualize them playing the arcade machine, where here it has Amanda not being able to go on a date because she's stuck working at the bar, so instead she visualizes a date with Max, which is all just again very tropey there. But it's still better than the Vin romance, which I just think, again, is so cringy. Especially in the fact that it starts off with this weird conversation of you playing Smash or Pass with your, like, fellow colleagues and students, which is, again, so weird. And again, I never found Vin to be an interesting romance option in the slightest here. But it's also, while we're here, that we can have a conversation with Reggie, which I did think was a pretty good conversation here. Again, one of the few in the game where she talks to him about how even she is a fuck up. And again, I thought that was some good content there. But after leaving the bar, we do culminate the episode with the reveal that someone has broken into Max's house, and as we clean things up, we end up hearing a noise in the dark room. So we go inside to find out it's the other Max. So we had this big chase sequence with her, which again, really funny. We're getting a chase sequence in the Life is Strange game, which leads to Max touching the other Max to where they don't end up instantly dying like Alderman, to where again, what a reveal, that's not actually another dimension version of Max. And we end the episode with Max saving the other Max with the reveal that it's actually Safi. Thing is to chapter 4, Diptych, where right away we got to get a lot of focus around this reveal that Safi is actually the shapeshifter, which I was like, I actually don't mind. I do think this is actually a really interesting reveal here, one that obviously recontextualizes the rest of the story up to this point, and I actually think adds a lot of nuance to previous scenes that I actually really liked on the replay, though Obviously, what they do with her beyond this, very questionable, but I did at least like the initial premise here of there, again, being another person with powers and us seeing them interact for what is really the first time in Life is Strange. Throughout Life is Strange, this series has never obviously been about the powers and about what the actual powers are, and again, it's definitely a topic we'll talk about a bit more as we get towards the end of the game. I do feel like it's still something that, again, I thought was an interesting premise here at least. But again, here we do have Sophie and Max finally being open with each other. But again, it is here where we get the reveal that all these bad things we've been hearing about Sophie are actually true. We do clearly get these vibes from Sophie here that she wants to use her powers in this more villainous sort of way, which again, we'll talk about that a bit more later. But the scene does culminate in us agreeing to work alongside Sophie in order to take Lucas down and get revenge for Maya, leading to really the bulk of this episode, which is really this big sequence of Max and Sophie pulling off this operation to take Lucas down, all taking place within the bar, which conceptually at least I really like this section. I mean, it has us interacting with a lot of the game's characters and trying to get them on board with taking Lucas down. Beyond that, we also have to get access to the projector by weirdly getting the Dead World's Moses to help us break it, which was a weird sequence. And along with that, I'll also mention the fact that I did actually feel really bad for Dead Moses in this situation, spot where he's literally just alone in Dead World, sitting in the bar, while on the other side is literally every character in the game at the bar all at once. It's kind of this depressing visual there, where I did like this little moment of Moses breaking his gingerbread house's chimney and us getting Sophie in the other world to give hers to him, which I thought was a pretty endearing moment. But here we also end up working alongside Sophie and convincing Lucas to go through with this upcoming announcement about a movie deal he has in the process, which is obviously where we proceed to sabotage him, revealing to the others that he stole this from Maya Okada. Though there ends up being another choice here that ends up being the final death knell for him, and Sophie getting to join the fray in a spot where we can either convince her to go as herself or use her powers to take him down, in a spot where obviously you tell her to go as herself. I feel like it's very strange to tell her to use her powers, as again, I feel like that doesn't really feel in line with the overall narrative as a whole, and really just in general, it's a much more endearing moment there to see the real Sophie confronting Lucas. Though very strangely also, this doesn't actually do anything, right? In reality, it's this is literally just a bar that now knows that he stole all this, where if this was really in the real world, this would seem pretty easy to hide all this. But again, at least for the game, it feels like this satisfying moment of taking Lucas down, only for Lucas to proceed to call Sophie away to where they have a conversation. For immediately following this, everything goes to shit, where Sophie's powers start to get out of control. Who guessed this? Seems like the pieces are coming into motion for Sophie's death scene, where we see the storm in front of us and us confronting Sophie at the Overlook as she's confronting Yasmin, with the reveal that Yasmin was covering all of it up and was actually the one to shut down Sophie's book deal, which again, kind of obviously, I felt like that was pretty apparent. Again, I felt like that was clearly where all this was heading, where, again, that didn't really surprise me in the slightest. But what did is the fact that Sophie proceeds to shoot Yasmin, which obviously shows her really losing control here. But also, again, her coming off very villainous in this moment, where we culminate the episode with Max realizing that she has to stop all this by, again, being able to use her time travel powers again to time travel through a photo back to the events of Sophie's death, but also from a different spot for some reason. Again, none of this really makes sense. Take us to chapter 5, the final chapter, Decoherence, which is pretty much summing up this entire game. Where it is here where we obviously get the same confrontation with Sophie, that with them now being teleported to the past, with the storm still in front of them, I guess. Don't know how, considering back in Life is Strange 1, when Max teleported to the past, the storm didn't follow her in those spots. I don't know why it does in this specific spot. But again, here Sophie does come off a bit more sympathetic, talking about all the people she's hurt, and wants Max to actually put her down. Again, making it make sense why Max kills her, I guess. Only for in this spot, Max to not kill her and throw the gun into the storm and proceed to enter the storm somehow. Where, again, this is so perplexing. None of this makes sense. Where, again, it's very much implied up to this point that obviously all this is a time loop. That, again, Max has to end up killing Sophie because that's what happened. But here, Max just doesn't do that for some reason, and it's not explained why. What is the difference here between the other situation where she does kill Sophie? Again, not explained. at all, never going to be explained, and again, just makes no sense. But once entering the storm, we do again get the typical nightmare sequence that is the way that really all these Life is Strange games end, and I've stood by this over time. I don't like these sections. I've never particularly liked these sort of sections in games just in general. I don't feel like they're particularly interesting ways of culminating your story by just literally having the main character reveal their psyche to you in this way. It just feels so on the nose. But again, to be fair, that's a criticism I have with the original game. That's a criticism I have with something like True Colors, which is also a game I really like. So again, it's not like this is a new criticism, but it is something I will complain about. But also, like, to be fair, it's also not even really a real nightmare sequence at most points, where I believe this is real, where this is essentially a spot where the two realities seem to merge, where again, from this point on, the two realities merge. But I believe these events are actually happening, but also it makes no sense how these events are happening. Like, how is Max going to all these locations? Where again, we see her in the University Plaza where she meets up with Diamond, where again, it's very much implied Diamond's hours, which we'll later talk about. But again, she goes alongside Diamond only for her to open the door and find herself at the observatory now. Somehow. Don't know how, but that's when she has a conversation with Moses. And obviously, again, this is all obviously these like series of these like farewell sequences with each of these characters, even though we proceed to have other farewell sequences with them. But again, we essentially have to break them out of Safi's spell by using double exposure on them, which, to be fair, I didn't mention this beforehand, but obviously within the photo mechanic in this game, there is a mechanic to do double exposure. Again, overlay two images, which looks terrible. But the way to defeat Safi here is by taking photos of each of these characters and use double exposure on them, so that's something. But following this moment with Moses, we then do get a dream sequence moment of her at Blackwell and reliving the moment of Chloe's death, but with her being Nathan and Chloe being played by Safi, which is very strange, which also I'll say, like, very weird in the sense that in the Chloe's Alive timeline, this makes no sense that this is like the main point of trauma for Max. Where, like, wouldn't you think in that timeline, her main trauma would be the fact that she destroyed her entire hometown more so than this moment of Chloe dying, where again, she didn't end up dying in this timeline, but either way, we then also get another weird sequence following this of her like dealing with her trauma over Jefferson, which again is also hardly tackled in this game, but we strangely have her like having to strap herself into a chair like she was with Jefferson and then break herself out, which again, I just felt like all this was weirdly structured. Also, while we then proceed to have a moment with Lucas, which again, is this real? Because it's like, how did Lucas end up in the bowling alley, and what connection does he have with the bowling alley? And again, I get that he's next to Mayo Okada's tree at this point, but again, all this just was so weird. And then we follow that up with a moment with Vin and Reggie, who also can be in a relationship at this point, which good for them, I guess. But once leaving the bowling alley, we end up at the bar, somehow talking to Amanda, who again, later remembers this conversation, so again, clearly this is real, but again, how? And we're given the goal here of talking to Gwen outside. When trying to go outside, we didn't get teleported to a hotel room, leading to a dumb dream sequence of us having to go through hotel room after hotel room. Again, obviously playing into Max's like running away and living in all these different hotels, but I felt like this section was just, again, so tedious to play. And it ends up being so on the nose too, but again, the game just like telling us its themes in this moment, which is so funny. But after talking to Gwen, we finally get back to Safi, who talks about now wanting a clean break and proceeds to tell Max about how he thinks that they're gods and clearly wants to use her powers in this like overtly villainous way, and also proceed to want to find other people with powers and gather them together, which is where this game goes just so over the top. Again, this is so stupid. And it's funny too, because I remember actually at a point where I actually thought of this as a potential idea, like getting all these Life is Strange characters, all these powers, and getting them together in one story. But I think in retrospect, I realized that that's such a ridiculous concept, but they're actually doing it. That is what they're doing here. And that is so funny. Again, it's such a dumb idea. So again, Life is Strange has never been about the powers. Again, the powers have simply been this way for the characters to deal with the grief that they face over the course of the story. And the fact that this game at this point, again, has Safi becoming this like new supervillain that's creating this team of people with powers is again just so stupid. And we do get this final choice with Safi on whether or not to side with her, which it's like, why would we side with her? And it's ridiculous actually that the majority of people do. You look at the analytics at the end of the episode, and the majority of people do agree with Safi, which is like, why? Why do you agree with Safi? Being a very clear decision of just right or wrong. I get people that want to agree with Safi in the sense that, again, I guess some people like Safi by this point in the story and want to just be with her, but again, I feel like that's so stupid when she's literally talking about abusing her powers in this way. But and also really funny because I believe this choice doesn't matter. Safi leaves anyway, and all that really matters, again, whether or not she's happy with you as she leaves, where again, the following scene ends up happening anyway. So again, all this is just such a funny final final decision for this game. Again, go from the final decision of Life is Strange 1, which is such an impactful one that actually does work in both ways and has so much impact, no matter which choice you pick of sacrificing Arcadia Bay or sacrificing Chloe. Again, those are some pretty impactful choices that lead to very different ramifications. This game, the choice is just side with Safi or not, in which both cases she leaves and wants to create a team of supervillains, which is so weird. But again, the game doesn't actually end there just yet. Shockingly so to me. I really thought that would be the end, but no, we actually get a final farewell sequence of first up being able to walk through the campus for the final time, during which we again can have final conversations with Loretta and Lucas that don't matter. Also, we'll have a phone call with Yasmin, which also doesn't matter. And we finally then reach the bar where we can have final conversation with Amanda, with Vin, with Reggie, and Gwen. That also don't really matter. You can have a conversation with Diamond that I guess matters a little bit more considering what we'll talk about. And we can take photos of them, I guess. And we end the game by having a conversation with Moses, where we proceed to finally decide to open up to them and tell them the truth, which I would say is a good ending point to the story theoretically. Again, the fact that Max is stopping from running away from her past, that she is finding a home, and that she is opening up to people. Again, I think that's good conceptually. The problem is I feel like it's done in such a shallow way where I feel like very little of this game actually tackles those themes. And also, those are themes that were tackled in the original game that can be rectified in the original game, of stopping looking at the past and more so looking at the future, where it's again funny this game again tries to make this final scene out of essentially doing something that the original game already did. But anyway, again, that's not the end just yet, because we got to get one final post-credit scene, which is so funny. And it's something that is so over the top because, again, it plays into that final scene with Safi and the fact that we get a scene of Diamond at the Overlook having a nosebleed, revealing that obviously she has powers of some sort, where we then see Safi come up to her and say, I've seen nosebleeds like that before, which is like, who says that? But again, obviously this leading to Safi recruiting Diamond for her supervillain team, which is so stupid. Again, it becomes very clear at this point that it really just feels like they're ripping off X-Men, but also it becomes very clear this game is essentially this supervillain origin story for Safi, and it also like recontextualizes Diamond, and the fact that all those previous interactions with Max, where she doesn't like Max, becomes clear why that happens now, because she obviously has the turn on Max in this moment. It's like, this is so stupid. And literally, again, the final shot of the game, the final thing this game has to offer is a title screen saying Max Caulfield will return, which is also so funny because it's literally like they're treating this like the MCU. And again, that is so not Life is Strange. And again, please don't. I would rather you not have done another Max Caulfield game at this point. I do think this game, again, is just such a bizarre sequel to the original game. And the fact that it's not even really a sequel, where by the end of the story here, again, it very much just starts a new story just with Max Caulfield there, where it feels like it does have very little connection to the original game outside of just this being Max Caulfield. And it feels like it's more so just telling this new story and setting up this new story more so than actually trying to be that much of a true sequel to the original game, which is actually part of the reason why I don't feel as angry about this game. Where again, coming out with Before Storm, I hated Before Storm with a passion because of how much I feel like it takes away from the original game, where I feel like this game doesn't really do that as much. Again, obviously we got the Chloe stuff from earlier, but outside of that, I feel like it doesn't, simply because it's not really that connected at all outside of just involving the character Max Caulfield, which is why, while I do think there are so many aspects of this game that are really stupid, and again, I've obviously criticized a lot of aspects of this game, it's not really in a spot where I genuinely hate this game. Again, obviously that is the entirety of Life is Strange Double Exposure. I mean, as I said, again, I don't hate this game. It's more so like, I recognize that this game is bad. I do think there's a lot of ridiculous moments that I can actually find funny more than anything. Either way, well, there are, again, some good points at points. Again, I do think some of the writing at points can be good. I think there's a lot of intrigue set up at the very beginning, and I think, again, in retrospect, there are some scenes that are pretty interesting considering later reveals. It's still a game that, again, is just such a mess. None of the game makes sense. Again, Max's powers make no sense. All the timelines make no sense. The ending is just, again, so ridiculous. Obviously, you have things that, again, mess with the overall canon of the series. Where again, there's not much to really, truly like from this game from my point of view. But again, I actually didn't hate the entire experience, to where, again, at least in comparison to something like Before the Storm, at least think it's better than that, even though, again, that might not be the popular opinion. But again, those are my thoughts on Double Exposure. So again, I'll probably end up playing the sequel. I'll probably find it funny because I think it'll be ridiculous. This notion that Safi's now going to be leading this like team of supervillains and Max is going to have to deal with that somehow. Or again, if I'm still around doing this channel by that point, expect another review of that game when it comes out. As again, I think it'll probably be fun to make fun of, like I made fun of this game. I also do do want to redo my Life is Strange 1 video at some point. I was initially going to do it sometime next year for the 10-year anniversary. Sadly, those plans have kind of fallen through to where, again, don't know when it'll actually be, but at some point I would definitely like to redo that video, as I do feel like I have a lot more to say about it at this point, and probably a lot more nuanced thoughts on the game. And I think also now, the context of double exposure, I think it would be really funny to reanalyze the game as well. So again, maybe that'll be something I do at some point. And while it's not particularly relevant to this game, I do intend on doing a ranking of every Don't Nod game at some point, probably after the release of Lost Records, or again, at least that's Life is Strange adjacent. So again, stay tuned for that as well. But really outside that, again, expect more of the same style of content from the channel. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.